So we'll begin this afternoon's presentations with the American Society of Naturalists Young Investigator Award winners. We have 4 this year, and we should get some outstanding talks today. The 4 award winners are Lucy Aplin, who is currently a junior research fellow at Oxford University. She got her PhD in 2013 from the Australian National University and Oxford. And Lucy works mainly on social cognition in birds. Our second presentation will be by Susan Bailey, who got her PhD in 2013 at the University of Ottawa. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at Aarhus University, and she works primarily on experimental evolution in the laboratory. Matthew Pinnell got his PhD in 2015 from the University of Idaho. He's currently a Killam Insert postdoctoral associate at the University of British Columbia, and he says that next week he will become an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. So welcome to the, I don't know if you want this job, but welcome anyway. And our final speaker today will be Nathaniel Sharp, who got his PhD in 2014 at the University of Toronto, and he also is a Killam Insert postdoctoral fellow at UBC. So our first speaker today will be Lucy Aplin, and I'll just bring her up because y'all don't want to hear me talk. We'll let her talk. Lucy, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, so, right. Pardon? Here we go. Brilliant. So I'm talking about cultural inheritance and social networks in birds today, and I want to start with a sort of an argument that I think no one would probably disagree with, which is that humans are cultural animals, and that most and many of our behaviors are influenced, at least partly, by social learning and the cultural transmission of information. Everything from our song, to our courtship behavior, to our foraging behaviors, to our social systems themselves. However, it's still really an open question as to how far we can extend this idea to other animal species. Certainly, recent research has shown that many animals, many taxa, show socially learned behaviors, and that social learning is important in the development and expression of behaviors, of a wide range of behaviors, from migration routes in birds such as cranes and ibis, in movements in whales, to song in whales and birds, to foraging behavior and tool use in those kind of classically studied primate species. And primate species have been a real flagship study taxa for also the idea of animal culture, this idea that we can extend social learning if these behaviors are shared and transmitted within groups, stable over generations and differ between groups, to the idea of traditions and animal cultures. And this really views social learning as a kind of conservative force. However, social learning can also act as an agent of change, enabling behavioral flexibility and rapid behavioral responses to changing environments and novel challenges. And this was really first kind of noticed in this classic example of milk bottle opening in great tits. And so in 1921, these birds were first observed opening milk bottles on doorsteps in southern England to steal cream. And this was then observed across most of the UK over the next 2 decades and appeared to spread from a few sources. What we don't know is the exact processes that were occurring in this case, or what might have happened if it had been allowed to continue. Obviously, the design of milk bottles changed. However, we can hypothesize that it may have been something like this. So we have a novel challenge or opportunity. In this case, it's a new resource of milk or cream. We have a behavioral innovation on the part of one or a few individuals of how to access this new resource. We have social learning and the transmission of information through the population, leading to a population-level change in behavior with evolutionary consequences. We might have seen quite a dramatic niche shift on the part of these birds, and even potentially evolutionary implications. And I'm really interested in this middle stage here, which is the question of how an innovation on the part of one individual, which would otherwise live and die on the part in that individual's lifetime, can result in a population-level change in behavior through this process of social learning and transmission. And this process can be influenced by a multitude of factors, which we can class as both social. That is, we can have an influence of social foraging strategies, produce scrounger games, up to the social context. The social environment might act as a substrate for the spread of information, all the way to population-level demographics, particularly if we see intergenerational transmission of information. However, it can also be influenced by individual-level factors. For example, developmental constraints, if individuals can only learn perhaps at stages in their lifetime, individual variation in cognition, or limits to cognition, limits to what they can learn. And also we might see the influence of learning rules if individuals only learn in particular circumstances or learn particular types of behavior. So my research addresses all of these 6 areas, and I'll focus on 4 of them particularly today. And I do this in the bird I've already introduced, the great tit, which I would argue is great. And we know this because they have a series of innovations that have been reported from that original milk bottle one onwards, which suggests that they're a good candidate for this sort of research. We also know that they're very neophilic and exploratory, like this one investigating my camera here. And this has been hypothesized to be one of the reasons why they've been so successful colonizing new environments, for example, urban spaces. We also know they have natural traditions in their behavior, most obviously in their song, with song dialects in different populations. And in the non-breeding season, they're very social, so they form foraging flocks, which gives the opportunity for the transmission of information. So I work in a population of great tits that's been studied for over 70 years now in Whiteham Woods in Oxfordshire. And in the last 15 years, there's sort of been a miniature revolution in this population and in tagging technologies in this population. And all birds are now tagged as birds in the nest, and then also as adults with these microchips, which allow them to be tracked. And in the wintertime, these tags register in contact with antennae that we put on bird feeders. The birds come very readily to bird feeders, allowing us to record the spatial temporal foraging behavior. And we have a grid of these feeders, 65 in total, we put across the woods that open to record a snapshot of their foraging behavior once a week for the entire winter. And this really allows us to tell where they're foraging, but also who they're foraging with. And it's the who they're foraging with which is interesting for my research and the research of the lab group that I work in, because it allows us to build social networks. So from many thousands of observations of 2 individuals foraging together at the same place and at the same time, we can build a social network that encompasses 1,000 or more individuals. So this is for one winter season, and the 2 things I want you to note here are firstly that there's variation in how social individuals are, that's represented by the size of the nodes there, and also that individuals are very consistent in how social they are. So both between winters and within winters, birds show consistent variation and repeatable social variation in their social behavior. So the 2 experiments I want to talk to you particularly today use this as my innovation. And this is a bidirectional door puzzle box that the pit tags interact with. And we can use this to sort of seed a new behavior, a new resource into the population. So in the first experiment, I built a whole series of these puzzle boxes. I then went and targeted birds from the woods, which I knew from the social network, and I brought them into captivity, where I subjected them to one of 3 conditions. So in the first treatment, the bird that I brought into captivity was trained to open this bidirectional puzzle box door by sliding it from the left to the right to access the mealworms that are inside. In the second condition, the bird that I caught was trained to open the same puzzle box but by sliding the door from the right to the left. And in the third condition, they weren't given any training, so this acted as a control. I then placed puzzle boxes out in the woodland. So I had 8 relatively isolated subpopulations within this larger area, and within each of these I put 3 puzzle boxes out 250 meters apart. So here, every population is given the identical treatment except for the innovator that I've seeded into that population. So in 2, the birds I put back, so I put back 2 birds in each population, were trained on solution A, 3 they were trained on solution B, and 3 they were given no training. And these controls really act to try and understand the underlying rates of innovation that we might observe without social learning. So what did we find? Well, in the treatment subpopulations, the red and blue lines, the information really spread like wildfire. And we saw these really distinctive sigmoidal curves where you see an exponential uptake of the solving of this puzzle box until it plateaus out at about 70% of the population. And each subpopulation was on average 100 individuals. This contrasts with the control populations where nothing much happens. These are the ones in green, until about 10 days on average when an individual seemed to have innovated, and then we saw an exponential increase. We could track this through social networks. So here the yellow 2 individuals are the original trained innovators, and the birds are turning red in the order at which they acquired the information. And hopefully it's obvious that social ties were extremely important for the acquisition of the information. And this network-based diffusion analysis also allows us to ask whether individuals are more or less likely to learn than we would expect given their social position. And in fact, what we could identify was that juveniles, birds in their first year, were twice as fast to learn the behavior as adults. Sorry. More broadly, we found that the time of their arrival, their contact with the puzzle box, was correlated with their centrality in the network. So birds which had a higher degree, that were more social in general, tended to receive the information earlier than those that were more peripheral to the social system. So this gave them the opportunity to learn, but the time it then took them to actually learn once they had arrived wasn't related to their general sociality. That was related to those specific social interactions that they had, as well as individual variation in cognition. So we know that they learnt the puzzle box, but did they learn the specific information I was giving them? Well, yes, they did. So if I provided them with a demonstrator trained on solution A, the vast majority of solutions in that population were also of solution A. And this got up to sort of 12,000 solutions by the end of it in one area. And this contrasts with if I trained them on the opposite solution, then the majority of solutions were also of that. And in the control populations, it was really random as to what was preferred, so there didn't appear to be any laterality in choice. So from 2 birds trained in captivity to open this little door and get a mealworm, the information spread to hundreds of individuals in the wild, all using the same technique that they had socially learnt to access this food resource. And the important thing to remember here is that both solutions to this puzzle are equally difficult and equally rewarding. And so it's an arbitrary choice, and if all individuals follow the same choice, we can imply that this really is socially learnt and maintained as a tradition. So this puzzle box interface with the pit tags also allows us to look at more detail of the learning. And what we first wanted to ask was whether we had any evidence for adaptive social learning rules. That is, are individuals optimizing their learning to improve the outcomes? And there's been a whole series of these that have been hypothesized to should evolve in animal populations. And they have important implications for how information is transmitted and spreads and persists. So we have evidence for state-based learning, that is, that juveniles learnt faster than adults, but we also found evidence for frequency-dependent learning. And so I'll explain this in more detail. So imagine this scenario. This bird, it's naive, it's turned up at the puzzle box, and it's in a flock of 6 other individuals, which actually is their average flock size. 4 of those individuals are showing solution A, and 2 of those individuals are preferring solution B. If that individual just copies the one that occurred before it, or in proportion to its group, you should see a linear relationship between the frequency of the variant in that group and its probability of adoption of that variant. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see a sigmoidal relationship, which suggests that individuals are disproportionately likely to copy the most common variant. So in this particular example, instead of a 4 in 6 chance of learning solution A, that bird has a 100% chance of learning that solution. And this initial solving also affected their subsequent decision making. So individuals gravitated towards the most common solution over time in their population. So this just shows one area and birds that tried both sides, and you see that even birds that initially started on the opposite side eventually gravitated towards what the majority of individuals in that population were doing. This then had population level consequences, because there was an increasingly entrenched population level bias to one behavior over time in each population, leading to, by the end of the experiment, almost all individuals in the population choosing to do the seeded variant. Our final piece of evidence for this sort of conformist learning comes from those few individuals who moved between areas. We didn't have a lot of them, so we couldn't do much analysis on it, but we could say that of the birds that moved between areas with the same tradition, only 4% of them changed their preference to match the area they moved into. But by contrast, birds that moved between areas that had different local traditions, over 70% of them switched their behavior to match the local tradition of the area they moved into. So why might we see this sort of adaptive, or these sorts of learning rules? Well, I would suggest that these could be a good strategy for spatially variable environments, because dispersing individuals can quickly acquire and learn the best locally adapted behavior by sort of taking a shortcut and copying what the majority of individuals in that environment are doing. So this is all very well and good, but we only have, this is a 4-week experiment. We might want to know what the effect over a longer period of time is. So I did this by going back into each of the populations for at least 1 more year, and 2 of them for 3 years. And these birds live on average 2 years, so I had a 50% population turnover each year. And the first thing to say is that the birds remembered the puzzle box. They also remembered their preference at the puzzle box. And then they also transmitted this to the next generation, to the naive individuals. So here's just one example of a population I followed over 3 generations, and you can see that the preference for red for the solution B is just as strong in the 3rd year as it was in the 1st. So we could say that a single trained innovator is sufficient to establish a persistent arbitrary behavior performed by the majority and transmitted to the next generation, what we would call a experimentally induced cultural behavior. So the next question we might want to ask is whether or not we see any learning curves. Do individuals improve at this skill? Well, here's a video taken from one puzzle box in 1 hour to show you that they definitely vary in how good they are at it. So this is one I would class as not particularly efficient, followed by an average individual, and one that I would say is pretty fast. And indeed, over time, both populations and individuals become much faster. And this increase in speed follows power law learning curves. So that's on the right-hand side, you see an individual from the population on the left. It starts taking about 17 seconds, and it ends up taking about 1 second to solve. That benefits birds that learn later in the experiment. So birds that arrive right at the end of the 4 weeks first learn a faster solution to the puzzle box than those that are started at the beginning, but it also benefits later generations. So in the first generation, individuals' first solve at the puzzle box was on average 5.5 seconds. The second of these box plots is that subset of those individuals that survived the second year, just to show you there's nothing different about them. And then afterwards, their first arrival to the puzzle box in the second year. And you can see that those birds have improved in their first year and then remembered that skill level and solve at 1 second on average on their first arrival in the second year. However, this benefits naive individuals in the second year because their speed at the puzzle box is almost half that of the initial generation. I have two populations where I have 3 generations. You can see this trend continues. It's not significant between the second and third population, but I suspect that's because I'm basically bottoming out. These birds really can't get much faster at this. They're already top. And this shows you that a whole package of information is being transmitted here. An arbitrary solution choice and also the skill at which you can solve this. So this is a nice sort of pretty picture of an innovation leading to an established cultural behavior that seems to be beneficial. However, social behaviors maintained as social traditions may be vulnerable to temporal changes in the environment, leading to mismatched, suboptimal, or maladaptive behaviors. So we might even say it's a trap. So I don't believe that my great hits would fall into this trap. However, they are conformist learners, and conformist learning can perpetuate out-of-date behavior with temporal changes in the environment because you're still copying what the majority are doing. And I suspect there's 2 possible ways out of this trap. Firstly, individuals may start innovating themselves, asocially learning, if they get a lower reward than what they expected to get for an established traditional behavior. Or alternatively, they could be using a whole toolbox of social learning strategies, of learning rules, including perhaps copying the high payoff that they observe. And this is what humans do. If they observe an individual doing something different and getting a better reward than the majority, they'll switch from being conformist and they'll copy that individual. So to test this, I did an experiment where I went into 4 populations, 2 of different traditions, where they're getting equally high rewards for doing either solution. I then widened the door so I could give them a different reward for either side, and I gave them equally low rewards. And here I would expect if they show individual sampling after receiving a lower reward than expected, I should see them start to switch to try sampling the other side. I then played a cruel joke, and I gave them a higher reward in the non-preferred side for that area and a low reward in the side which was the established local tradition. And here I'm really depending on those few individuals that I kind of call mavericks. So about 5% of each population insists on stubbornly doing the other side. And so now they're the information source that there's a better alternative. So just to show you what this looks like, this bird's arrived and there's the seed and it knows it doesn't want seed. Whoops, sorry. Can you start that movie? And it gets the worm it wanted. So this shows you on the left the initial experiment. So they're extremely biased. This is at the end of the initial experiment to either solution A or solution B, depending on their population. You can see that this does not change at all with equal low rewards. There does not seem to be individual exploration and sampling in this system. But we do see a jump towards the opposite solution when we give them unequal payoffs. This happens, but it's not quite as fast as I would have expected. It's definitely not the exponential uptake that we saw in the initial experiment. So what's going on? Well, to understand this, we built firstly a sequential learning model. So for every event that the bird comes and solves, we ask what's its memory of what it did before and what has it just observed other birds doing. So in this way, we can separate out its personal experience and its social information and also some extra innovation. So we know that personal experience contributes about 70% of their decision making and social information about 25%. And if we take the social information out of that and look at it separately, we can see that birds remain conformist. So they remain stubbornly conformist even when that means copying a lower reward payoff, which we found actually a little surprising. However, the population does appear to be partly tracking this change in the rewards. So what's going on? Well, first, we have to remember that this population is structured. It's not free mixing. Oh, could you start that movie too, please? And so here you've got the two mavericks in the green there, and the population's preferring blue, but they are switching over to red. And in fact, what we see is that local clusters mean that occasionally individuals receive the right circumstances to get that high reward information. And when they do receive that information, they're very quick to lodge it into their personal experience, and that process is payoff biased. And when they've experienced the higher reward, they do that in future. However, individuals vary in how good they are at this process. In fact, again, we see an age difference. So juveniles, or birds in their first year, are much more able to update and flexibly change their personal information than adults. And this has consequences because by the end of the experiment, it was those younger individuals which were able to change and had switched to preferring the high payoff reward, while as birds became older, they appeared to be less able to do this. That said, this was a relatively short 3-week experiment, and we still saw about half the population switching to this higher reward, better tradition. And so eventually, over time, we would have seen a snowball effect. As more and more individuals switched, this allowed even the most conformist individuals to switch as well, and the population would have changed and been able to track this temporal change in the environment. So to conclude, we see experimental evidence for the cultural diffusion of innovations that we planted into this population. And innovations not only spread, they persist. So we have arbitrary traditions that persist over 3 generations, and I've just observed 4 generations. What's more, individuals improve in their efficiency and speed of this behavior, and they appear to transmit this improved skill level to the next generation. So really what we're seeing here is a sort of package of behaviors being transmitted socially within generations and between. When environments change, individuals remain conformist, even if this means copying a lower reward payoff. So we would expect that in this case we would see a mismatch, so social learning would lead to a worse outcome. However, the population does track the environmental change, and it appears to be the case that having payoff biased individual updating combined with a structured population allows this to occur, with the caveat that younger birds are the ones that are showing this flexibility. So if we go back to this original pathway that I outlined, you can see that the two that we had both, we followed this through almost to the final stage. We couldn't really do that, but we did result in a population level change in behavior. And the 2 take-home messages I really want to add to this are firstly that this is the spread of innovation leading to culturally established behaviors, and the cultural transmission of behaviors is a potentially important component of the life history of a whole series of species, and may be an important way in which species or individuals and populations can show rapid behavioral responses to novel challenges or opportunities in their environment. The second take-home message I really want to add to that is that a multitude of factors affect this process, both social factors, in particular the social context and population demographics, but also individual factors, so learning rules, individual variation in cognition, and developmental constraints. And with that, I just have to thank my supervisors for my postdoctoral and my PhD work, the EGI Social Networks Group, who collaboratively collect a lot of that social network data, and my funding bodies. And thank you. So the question was, how easy is it to lose an acquired behavior? Well, we thought we would see a loss of this behavior between years, and in fact we didn't. The birds seem to retain, their memory seems to be very strong, and they can retain this behavior throughout their lifetime, even with only small sampling periods. However, you're right, having behavior socially learnt and maintain in the population as a culture does mean it is vulnerable to loss, particularly if you have things like small population sizes or fragmentation of populations. So yes, that's still an open question. Oh, right. More specifically, if we stopped giving them a reward for doing it, well, they would stop doing it. Because this is basically a novel resource that they're accessing using a new technique to gain it. However, positive reinforcement seems to be very strong in this species, at least, because there were a few instances where the mealworms would run out, and certainly over a day or two, they still keep coming back, and if you reward it again, then they're very fast to pick it up again. They can sort of socially learn that, or there's the social information that there's food again there is very fast to spread, very quick.
I was wondering about your result that the amount of learning saturates at about 70%, and whether you think that would hold over a longer period of time, and if there's something different about the birds that don't ever learn.
Yeah, that's a great question. So why I see this plateau at 70% of the population, how general that is, and why, I guess. So yes, it does appear to be general. I've done, since this, I've done another experiment with a different puzzle box, and I still see this plateau at 70%. I suspect that this is a combination of two factors. Firstly, some of that extra 30% is made up of really transient birds. So they're classed as being in my population, but they're not really very resident, so perhaps they didn't acquire the behavior because they're not there enough. But the other thing to say is that my population is also made up of producers and scroungers. And I didn't get time to talk about that, but we did see scroungers who very much preferred to follow a bird in and take food from it than to learn the behavior themselves. And there's a few predictors of why they would choose that strategy, but that seems to be very stable over the generations that we've followed.
Yeah. So that was actually my question. So I noticed this on the videos where you have these animals that would come in and and sort of sneak a bite before the door was able to close. That behavior didn't rise in frequency at all in the population over generations?
So I controlled it. So every puzzle box I allowed 2 possible scroungers for every solve. And I did this by the door shuts a second after the first bird leaves, after it's stopped being detected on the antenna. But if a bird arrives in that 1 second, it remains open for that bird until that second scrounger, and then it shuts after that and doesn't allow any more. However, I didn't see, so I saw between about 25 and 30% of each population chose this scrounging strategy. So that's still lower than the possible, 60% that you'd have with that 2 for every 1 solve. And that was extremely stable. It didn't increase in frequency. If anything, as birds became more and more experienced, they tended to switch to the solving strategy, and newer birds who arrived and had new opportunities would tend to go more for the scrounging strategy. And it just, I'm still looking into this because it's an interesting question how it might affect particularly the transmission dynamics, but it definitely seems to be the case that this is a very stable strategy and probably a sort of frequency-dependent strategy as well.
So my question has to do with the frequency dependence. In the populations where you didn't prime, where you didn't put the birds in who had some sort of knowledge, the expectation, I guess, would be that they would fix eventually or reach a high proportion of one or the other based on just sort of chance. Were you able to follow up with these guys past the 3 weeks or however long that first experiment was?
Yeah, great question. I wish I had hindsight. No, I didn't. So I suspect that eventually those populations would have reached the same level as my experimental treatments. They were slightly slower to take off in the control areas, which may well have been because of the extra training I gave my demonstrators. They had had a week in captivity learning this behavior, and in the control population, those innovators had to sort of acquire that behavior on the ongoing during the experimental period. However, I have been back to some control populations, and I still find birds that solve and remember how to solve there. So I suspect I could very easily go back in and see that this would then spread rapidly in control areas as well. So it just shows you how innovative these birds are in a way that this completely opaque puzzle box, no obvious sign or cues that there's food in it, and yet I still saw innovation in all areas I went to eventually, and then social learning from that innovation. Thank you.